Very warm welcome to this webinar today on school absenteeism. According to a recent New York Times article, 1 in 4 students was considered chronically absent in 2023. In Ireland, the numbers are similar. But these are not the only 2 countries that are facing these issues. Many countries across the OECD are seeing an alarming rise in the numbers of students being absent from school. So what's behind these numbers? How does absenteeism affect students from different backgrounds? What's the role of the media, families, school institutions, and the government? And finally, what can be done? With me today to tackle these questions are Dr. Michael Gary from Concentric Education Solutions. Mike is the Chief of Staff for Concentric Ed, a US-based company that provides districts and schools with individualized support to address the barriers that prevent students from becoming successful. Anya O'Keefe. Anya is the director of the TUSLA Education Support Service, or TESS. TESS seeks to improve student school attendance, participation, and retention in Irish schools for all children, with particular focus on supporting those most at risk of educational disadvantage and early school leaving. We have Bjorn Lesher Nuland, the director for the Division of Professional Development in the Norwegian Directorate of Education and Training. Bjorn's division has overall responsibility for supervising kindergarten education and the governance of the education sector. Finally, we have Andreas Schleicher, the OECD Director for Education and Skills. As a kind reminder to all those who've joined, and thank you, I see hundreds of people joining online, please feel free to ask your questions in the chat and we'll try to get to as many as possible. Let's start with Andreas, who will walk us through some of the OECD's most recent data on school absenteeism. Andreas, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sasha. And I just, you highlighted already levels of absenteeism in some countries have reached thresholds and levels that we can just no longer ignore. But we also need to understand that this is not a simple one-dimensional phenomenon. There are multiple aspects that enter into this. There is this issue of school refusal. Children may perceive, some emotional distress, anxiety, depression. There may be school phobia, basically students not going to school because they are fearful of some issues, or just truancy, just students being absent for other reasons, and some of them simply getting bored in school. And then there is, very selective absenteeism, students not joining particular lessons. So we need to look at those aspects separately and in combination to understand that phenomenon of school absenteeism. What drives it? Some factors are simply student-specific. You think about, teenage motherhood. You think students not doing well academically or having repeated grades or required to repeat a grade. They don't receive the support from families. No one at home, knocking on their door and saying, you've got to get up, get to school. Things like this. There may be factors that are family specific. You think about levels of, poverty. You think about parental involvement, housing, lots of things that you could happen at the context of the family that makes things difficult for students to be present. That's the demand side. You can look at the supply side as well. There can be school-specific factors, school facilities not being appropriate, school safety being an issue, simply the quality of services, of teaching not being adequate, students not perceiving their experience in schools to be relevant to their lives, and so on. And then there is the community that we need to take into account, that if you live in an area where there are no jobs for educated people, then, why should you study hard? There could be, again, safety issues in the neighborhood, not necessarily at school. There could be a lack of social and educational support service that are just essential for getting kids into school. So again, once you look at the drivers, you can see quite, complex web of factors that we need to examine and look at. Now, these are the data. We have studied that in our recent PISA survey, that was collected in 22 post-COVID. I think that's really important as a context because we can see that many countries absenteeism was a exception in the past, and during COVID, students figured out it's actually possible to be absent in school, and now it's hard for some countries to get people back. What is also interesting that this plays out quite differently across students from different contexts. You can see across countries in most systems, the light orange box. Now, this is the students who come from disadvantage. They come from relatively poor backgrounds. You can see levels of absenteeism are consistently higher for them. In some countries, but not everywhere, students with an immigrant background have a kind of a higher absenteeism, right, and so on. So we need to look at this by student background as well. But you look at those rates, these are significant numbers. You find pretty much, maybe one in every classroom in some countries. You do find also countries, like Korea, like Finland, like Portugal, that don't have much of an issue. So I think that's also interesting that this is not, a universal phenomenon, difficult to tackle, but it is a phenomenon that actually plays out particularly in some of the countries and differently for different student groups. Now, we ask 15-year-olds, and I should have said that these data all reflect what we see at the age of 15, which is a pretty good age to look at this phenomenon. Now, that's an age when the world of work becomes tangible for young people. They can make up their mind. They can perhaps also make their own decisions about school attendance. Now, so we ask them also, when you have missed schools for a long time, like 3 consecutive months, what was the reason for that? And sickness is obviously the number one reason. That's not so much a surprise. But then, you look at the second most important reason, and it's safety at school. And we can see huge variability across countries on this. Now, if you go to a school in Switzerland and in Austria, every student feels safe. But if you go to students, in some Latin American countries, you have a significant share of young people who do not feel that school is a safe place or the way to get to school is a safe place. And so that's something to take serious. But I want to highlight one reason in particular, because that seems to be the one most easy to address. The third most common reason is students simply say, look, I'm bored at school. Now, what they do there doesn't relate to, my life and my future. And that seems to be something that, we should be able to tackle quickly. If you would run a supermarket rather than a school, and you'd find every day, 2 out of 5 people, or 2 out of 10 people leaving your supermarket without buying anything, and you find that today, tomorrow, the week after, the year after, you change your inventory and you try to do things differently. And in school, somehow we seem to be too ready to lose a very large share of young people because we do not offer something that is relevant to them. And you can actually look at those who missed school due to being bored in more detail. It's really interesting. It's a large majority of boys. And it's also happening more prominently in high school, upper secondary education. Really signaling the moment, schools bring people closer to the world of work. That's where young people find alternatives, not being sort of engaged that much in school. So I think that's something that we should take to heart. There's gender in here, and then there is the level of education that are involved in this. I talked about absenteeism. Truancy is equally important. Here you can see basically the share of students who skipped a day of school at least once in the week before we did that PISA test. And you can see if you go to Italy, you get 60%. Turkey also, a majority of students. And once again, you can see how disadvantage is an important factor here to some extent, immigration. But on the left side, you can see Korea, Japan, Portugal, Netherlands, and so on, where that seems not at all a kind of issue, a problem. But on the right side, you can see that these levels have got very, very significant, very, very high. You can ask yourself, what difference does this make to students? What difference does it make to societies? And what our data show is that it is very harmful to students' long-term success. You miss out on school. Many of the subjects are are building on each other. Once you lose the train in the sciences, it's very hard to recover. Now, that's not so much an issue in history or so, but in some of the subjects which are cumulative in nature, you miss out somewhere, and it's going to be very, very hard to find your way back. Now, we also, in terms of data, you can see that here when students who missed schools for longer in primary education, they scored 35 points. And to give you a sense, that's more than a school year in lower in mathematics. And students who missed out in secondary education saw 41 to 59 points less. And that's, close to school years. It really shows you that two school years. Now, it really shows that this impact can be very significant and very hard to recuperate. And it's not the end of the story. You can also ask yourself, if kids perform less well in school, what difference does it make to our society? Now, there is a very clear connection with risky behavior, students' substance abuse, the feeling to be alienated, you lose that sense of belonging, disengagement, emotional well-being. Now, it's not so clear what cause and effect are on those. It could go both ways. If you are very disaffected, you might actually not want to go to school, and vice versa. But that connection is clearly there, and that is really important. And then there are the long-term economic consequences. What we know is that students who are not present are more likely to not complete their school. They are more likely to find, poor labor market outcomes. They see less in terms of lifetime earnings. And we don't have comparative OECD data on this, but we have some national data. We have a study from Sweden that found that, only 10 days every year being absent in primary school could decrease your lifetime earnings by 1 to 2%. Now, that's a big kind of loss in lifetime earnings from what seems to be a kind of very small number of days being missed. Now, we have a study in Ireland that found that overall lifetime costs that are associated with men leaving school early are approximately 30,000 euro in the benefits and lost tax revenue. Now, what is clear is that people who do less well in school, get less of school of this, are going to pay less taxes. So society actually pays indirect costs for this as well, not just the individual. So there's every reason for getting this right, and you could see that some countries are obviously doing a lot better in getting this right. So this brings me to the question, how can education systems respond to this challenge? And we try to find out by conducting a survey on this. This is part of our Education for Inclusive Societies project, and I have Lucy and Cecilia with me here. That is basically something that we did, and we collected data. We got 27 education systems providing data on this. And here you just see these are the reported changes in dropouts and truancy. Basically, if you look pre-COVID, post-COVID, you can see that there has been a significant increase in dropout in most systems that report data, and also a significant increase in truancy. So COVID really did change that pattern. It looks sort of similar. You look at dropout, truancy, both rows, but actually when you think about how this played out, you can see differences. The truancy is something you can see across the board, from early schooling to secondary, whereas dropout is really something that comes more towards the end, when young people no longer see, going to school makes sense for me. So I think that's a really important, distinction here to make, that dropout or fading out of school happens later. Truancy is something that you can see across the board. What we also found interesting is that the increases that you just saw, this overall massive increase in numbers of countries reporting, is not universal. You can see Australia, yes, we and did something about it, and you can see Austria not, in some reason, to some extent. In relation to the size of the phenomenon, of course. What is clear is that most education systems have done something about it. They have encountered that increase, and you can see 20 systems said, yes, we have policies to respond to this. Just 7 didn't have this. So what do those policies really focus on? Mental health, well-being. Yeah. Australia is an example where they said, look, we need to address the underlying causes why students do not go, and mental health and well-being have been identified as key drivers of this. I showed you that before. Becoming better at predicting and diagnosing a potential dropout, strengthening data collection, early warning systems. We found that in Chile, in Finland, and Norway. Dropout is usually not something that happens from today to tomorrow. There are early signals of dropout, and to understand those signals, to read those signals, and then to predict the phenomenon is really important. You can see some countries making efforts on this. Money. You can see funding to schools, funding for local entities that target resources. England, New Zealand have gone down that route and sort of using money in a very selected way to address dropout. You can make schooling compulsory. Raising the compulsory age in Estonia, Luxembourg has been used as a lever. I'm in mixed minds about it. On the one hand, yeah, you can make it compulsory, but it's probably better to make schooling interesting and relevant than just compulsory. Engaging communities. I think the Finnish example is really interesting. You could see that Finland is among the countries that did not see high levels of absenteeism, and it's a whole of society responsibility that you have many players in communities, and schools are very, very good in bringing together those different players in communities to address questions of a dropout. It's clearly something that schools cannot do on their own. They need the support from other, from health-related authorities, from social services, and so on. And again, Finland did already do well on this in the past and has redoubled its effort on this. Positive messaging, building capacity. Ireland, trying this, making schools interesting, relevant. Starting research around the topic. Spain and Sweden, better understanding this phenomenon of dropout, its drivers, its policies, their effectiveness, and then higher education specific measures. Student support, funding scholarships, reduced fees. You could see that in Canada and Spain. So you can really see a whole range of different angles that countries have done to address this phenomenon. And that, brings me to the last point, just to provide you with a larger context. Actually, the way we, find out about those things is actually by offering countries peer learning opportunities. School attendance matters for many countries as planning. So the best way I just showed you a list of what countries are doing, but we are finding out about those things actually by bringing countries together in a context where they can see, what works in your country, what does it work in my country, to share their experiences. Those exchanges are pretty informal in the sense, it's not about, going there with remarks and presentations, but they're very structured. We try to really structure them in the way to underpin the reasons and the policy challenges that countries in this dialogue share, and looking at diversity in solutions. Now, we also provide concise summaries of data, policies, and practices to sort of see what lessons can we generate from this that can help us extrapolate and support other countries. And then, comparative reports on this. And those kind of opportunities, I just want to highlight this here, are always open to new participants. If you're interested to learn from other countries how they address this or any other topic that relates to this question of diversity and inclusion, this is something that is very worth pursuing with the OECD. And find those kind of dialogues really, really interesting. What are the subtopics that we might be looking at? First is data. I highlighted this already. Now, how do we define absenteeism, how we capture it, how we measure it, how we build predictive analytics, early warning systems, how do we deal with data lacks? Sometimes you get that picture late in the day, we need to act very early on, and how we deal with, self-reported data like the ones I showed you from PISA and so on. Understanding the drivers, really, really important. And again, it could be, parental support, parental attitudes, it could be gender, mental health, It could be specific groups, students with special needs, immigrants, students from disadvantaged family contexts. What about peer contextual effects and so on? So understanding those drivers and, again, sharing experiences, how those drivers are identified and addressed. And then, obviously the policy responses. You want to just, make schooling longer. You want to focus on support services, on health. You want to better understand the phenomenon, tackle it earlier so that you avoid students dropping out by giving them support right in time early on. You want to do this through resources, giving students the kind of resources they do not have from their context, even if it's things like breakfast clubs and lunches and so on. Or you want to, look at interventions targeted at specific groups, including family. And then, looking at some of the results. Timing, that's really my last point I want to make here is in May. We've started with preliminary discussions. We have those peer learning discussions now planned for the period June to November. So this is the moment when countries get together to discuss the challenges and the solutions. And then July to December, we're going to try to distill the lessons from this in the form of policy briefs. And by next year, have a comparative report on absenteeism that brings all of that together. And that's really all. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Andreas. Well, I really wish I'd had your slides on boredom back when I was skipping school. I might have been able to use them to get out of trouble with the school principal, but anyways, that was a long time ago. But thanks so much. No, I think really, highlighting the fact that it really is a multidimensional issue that requires, a range of policy responses, used in combination or together. Is really highlights really, I think, the complexity of the problem. But let's turn to our country participants now and get more of a view from them on what the situation looks like in the US, in Norway, and in Ireland. So Michael, can I start with you? I think we've seen a lot of press about the crisis in the US. How would you characterize it? Is it a crisis? What does it look like? Did it start at COVID-19 or was it precipitated by it? Walk us through what the situation is like in the US, please.
It's definitely a crisis. Unfortunately, it's a crisis that has been uncovered by another crisis. Prior to the pandemic, Concentric was around. We've been around since 2010, and we've been doing this work around chronic absenteeism. And so the data suggests an increase, but it doesn't talk about oftentimes where it was, right? It's not a deep dive into the statistics around how bad chronic absenteeism was already in the schools in the States. So for us, we definitely see it as a crisis, but it's not a crisis that is, characterized by COVID-19. It's been something that we've been addressing for a very long time.
Thanks so much. And the rates did go up after COVID-19. So, I think one of and this is a question that seems to be coming up in the chat already, is that, obviously students being sick is one of the biggest reasons people are missing school. But as we've seen, infection rates have fallen, yet those numbers are remaining persistent. Do you have any idea why this may be?
So we have a couple of things going on. What it means to be sick isn't often defined at the school level. And we have families that report sickness as being the reason for absence because it's excused. In the United States, absence is an absence in most states. And so even though it may be an excused absence at the school level, at the state level, it is reported as an absence and it counts towards your chronic absenteeism rate. And so, with that disconnect between language and policy understanding, we have numbers that may increase around reports of students being sickness when that may not be the case. And then we also see an opportunity there, right? So if we have a better understanding of what it means to be sick at the school level, parents are better informed about when to actually keep their kids home. And then if one thing that the pandemic did do is introduce the asynchronous learning model into the conversation. So while students may be sick, they may not be too sick that they can't do work. So we just change the location where learning happens to the home.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. And I think you highlight already, a really interesting point, which is that we need accurate data on school absenteeism as well to be able to address the problem. And I know this is one of the things that Concentric is so interested in, and why you have a kind of family first, school student first approach. But let me turn to Anya now. I think the rates of absenteeism, if I'm not mistaken, are similar in Ireland. How would you characterize the situation in Ireland?
Thanks, Sasha. I think, as you pointed out, pre-COVID and post-COVID are different. And where we were in Ireland pre-COVID was we had, I suppose, plateaued at a really high level of overall attendance, with those in disadvantaged communities slightly behind, but overall our attendance and completion rates were at an all-time high. And post-COVID, what we've seen is a shift in that. We have seen a situation whereby I think schools, families, children, young people, communities who haven't maybe needed a school attendance and school attendance promotion service like my own before, they didn't need our attention, now do. And interestingly, today there is an article in one of our national newspapers based on a piece of research from our ESRI, commissioned by a school management body, that is beginning to talk about and identify that there are areas of challenge that we haven't seen before, and that these are now established. So we have schools, we have children, families and communities who need a response from us that have never needed it before. So I think we saw the origins, the sort of beginning of a shift into school avoidant behaviour, school reluctant behaviours pre-COVID, but it was, I suppose, a small shift. And what COVID seems to have done, or that sort of gap, children not able to attend school during school closures, is an acceleration of that pattern. And I suppose for us as policymakers and service providers, it is trying to figure out in all that's going on for those that we were traditionally engaged with who experience particular barriers to regular school attendance, and for the emergent groups who will need a particular response and do need a particular response. Who are they? What is the right response, and who can provide it? And how we all, I suppose, within my service, but across all school leadership, across all related providers for children and young people, think about the issue that's emerging, understand our data, ensure our data is gathered as good and robust, and figure out how we are going to respond to these emergent issues. So what we have seen in terms of chronic absenteeism in Ireland is an incredible uptick in that. Our last verified data is the 21-22 school year, where we still would have had a lot of public health messaging. So absence due to illness is probably kind of expected there. Families were making good decisions maybe about keeping everyone safe. So it will be very interesting for us to see, and we're quite close to having the 22-23 school year, which really didn't have any particular public health messaging to grapple with. Does that start to show us stepping out of this scenario in a big way? I've seen preliminary drafts, and I think we still have a way to go. So there is a COVID impact, undoubtedly, and I suppose part of the challenge for us now is how do we pivot what we've already learned over the last number of decades to bring the best response to bear as quickly and collaboratively and comprehensively as possible to the issues that we see emerging.
Thanks so much, Anya. And can I just confirm, you're seeing this across all sort of socioeconomic groups, all demographic groups? You're seeing this situation, similar rates of increase as in the US as well?
So what the report today is certainly indicating, and I've only read the headlines in a newspaper as opposed to the full report itself, it's just being launched today, is that there is an enduring impact of COVID, and that we really do need to figure out, as well as we do know that children in designated disadvantaged schools, how we think about it in Ireland, how the resource allocation goes, have been more impacted than others. But what we are seeing is that for a child in any demographic, in any school, there are impacts that are maybe a a reluctance that I just can't go in there. A young person who's particularly experiencing particular anxiety, as well as Andreas has outlined so clearly for us today, that sort of dropout, that boredom piece, that I have disconnected and the world didn't end. And I don't think we fully managed to define those categories. But yes, I suppose, Sasha, as you say, what we are starting to see emerge in Ireland is an impact across the board. So we need to think about, I think, in Ireland, framing school attendance improvement for everybody. It shouldn't just be a cause of concern for a school that traditionally had challenges in relation to attendance. We need everybody to think about what is it we want for our children and young people. What is our school attendance message? I think that's where we're at in Ireland.
Thanks so much, Anya. Bjorn, how does this resonate with you, what Mike and Anya have said? What's the situation like in Norway, and how especially is the role of the family and the relationship between families and schools impacting some of these issues?
I think the situation in Norway is quite similar to a lot of the things that we hear now from Ireland and the US. Before the pandemic, and traditionally, we've talked more about absence in upper secondary school and high school and more linked to short-term absence and truancy. But we now see a much more focus, and it's quite media-driven and from quite vocal parents being concerned that the feeling of their children, I think they would belong to the categories Andreas called school refusal and school phobia, or what the parents are calling involuntarily absence, that their children would like to go to school, but for some reason they don't feel they're able to. And it's often linked to feeling safe and feeling included, but it's not kind of a safety in terms of physical dangers, but just a sense of not feeling a part of school or included in the school community. And we worked for many years in Norway with the vision that all children are to thrive, develop, and learn in inclusive environments. And the collective aspect of learning has been very important. But after the pandemic, we see this more of a aspect of push for more individualism, that not all children feel that they're naturally part of this collective, or that this more one-size-fits-all approach to school is difficult for some children, and that challenges the way we work with it. Unlike Ireland and the US, we don't really have data on attendance and absence when it comes to elementary school and secondary school. So our data relies more on what we hear in the media, and there it is been an explosion of discussions and debates, especially driven by parents feeling that it's a difficulty of getting a good collaboration between the local school and parents about finding good solutions for the children to attend school. And when we see discussions where we talk to people working in schools, they often point to issues dealing with the individual or the family. That's the biggest obstacle for school attendance. But if we talk to the family, it's more pointed to aspects dealing with the reality in school. And there seems to be a bit of a mismatch. What's the problem? And as a result, it seems to be big problem of getting some of these children to school. And it seems to be in all parts of the country, not limited to some communities or all in disadvantaged groups. So it's changed its nature of how we talk about it. Whether the link to COVID is, because it's not really sickness either, it is how we make it's difficult, I think, to assess, but especially it's become a huge, one of the big wicked problems, I think, of the post-pandemic world.
So Bjorn, if I understand, what you're saying is that one of the effects of COVID was also a changing expectation around the role that schools would play in the lives of students from parents, from families. Is that right? Do you see that manifesting?
Well, it was definitely an increased awareness that school is an arena that's more, it's not just a place where you go to learn. It's also a place you go to be feeling a sense of normality, feeling a sense of belonging, feeling a sense of inclusion. And that the school's mandate is not only about educating people, it's also about socializing people and making young people learning how to be parts of a collective society. And I think the very important role both kindergartens and school plays in that aspect. was very much brought to the attention of everyone when we started closing down kindergartens and schools during COVID. And one of the big arguments for why it was so important to keep these places open for the well-being of children and students. And that has definitely been also a big aspect of the discussions also post-COVID. The importance that we see that the mandates of schools is talked about now a lot more to deal with a lot more challenges in society than purely the ones relating to educational outcomes.
Thanks so much. Andreas, I wonder if I can ask you to pick up on something that Bjorn said, which is that schools that had education systems that had shorter school closure times may ultimately have had different expectations around the role of school in society. Do we see any relationship between education systems that closed for longer or shorter and absenteeism in the post-COVID period, or do we not have data on that yet?
Yeah, we do actually, and you don't see that so much reflected in absenteeism, but the point that Björn made about student sense of belonging and school closures is very clear. You can see countries that had longer school closures, you have a more marked drop in student sense of belonging. And that really is where, that sense of safety and inclusion comes from. Is school a place where, I make friends, where I feel I belong, I feel that, the environment supports me. What is also quite clear, and, it's easy to point fingers at, the context, and this is always hard to change, but there are some factors that are really inherent in systems. We have seen, if we're honest, the decline in teacher support. If you look at the data from 2018 and 2022, you could see students generally support that their teachers are less, supportive for that, understanding who they are, who they want to become, accompanying them on that journey. That is hard to see to what extent that is, objective. This is the perception of students. And I think we should, look into factors that have driven that. We have seen, Björn said, parents complain. Actually, we have seen a marked decline in parental engagement and support. Norway would be the prime example. Parental engagement was always pretty low in Norway, but it's dropped to all-time lows during the last years. And I think, again, you look at all of those factors together and you can see clear trends. To what extent COVID has been the cause of that and the length of school closures have been the cause. In a way, I think what COVID has done, it has made schooling optional, at least in the minds of people. It's actually something that, you can be absent from school. Now, before you took it for granted, you go to school every day. And I think that's perhaps the biggest change that we have. But I think we should look at, the student sense of belonging. I think it's a really important factor here. The decline in teacher support, the decline in parental support, and I would even say in a number of countries, physical safety of schools. There is a significant share of students. The US would be a prime example here, where you do have a good number of students who just do not feel that school is a place where they feel safe or getting to school. And I think that's all something that we need to look at.
Thanks, Andreas. Mike, I know you have your hand up here, and I would love to get your views on these things that Andreas and others have talked about, the role of parental engagement, the role about the sense of belonging. Please go ahead, Mike.
So the interesting thing is that schools are becoming increasingly responsible for things that are outside of their direct responsibility, right? And so, when you become a teacher, you're in school and you're learning the subject matter that you're responsible for teaching in the class. Now you're being asked to become more so of a social services person, right? And schools are just not equipped to manage the social services needs of our students at such high levels. What we see is recommendations are around counselors in the school, right? Schools have a ratio about 1 to 432 students to counselors, and then the recommendation is around 1 to over 200, right? If you worked in any school, you understand that you have about 40 hours in a work week, and there's no way in the world that one person is going to be able to see 200 or even 35 students in an hour-long counseling session. And so what we have is that schools experience a lack of resources and ability to support students holistically because they can't meet their needs. And unfortunately, we're leaving the conversation at the school as a stakeholder and the parent and family as a stakeholder, but not the other stakeholders that are very much influential in how students engage and operate in society. So when we think about our cities and our states and our federal levels or other community partners or faith-based institutions, they all have to be at the table when we're trying to address chronic absenteeism, because the student isn't only engaged in the home or in the school, but they're also engaged in the community. For example, they have to walk to school. So what is the student experience while walking to school? Is there sidewalks? Can the student walk safely to school? Do they have to encounter people that are addicted to drugs? Do they have to worry about sex trafficking? There is a ton of issues that students have to consider that are just not facilitated at the home or at the school.
Thanks so much, Mike. Absolutely. I mean, I think this speaks to the fact that it really is a multidimensional, multifaceted issue that requires, a whole range of policy things to come together. And I hope we'll get to that part of the discussion shortly, because I think it's so interesting and important. But Anya, let me bring you back in. Much of the media attention, and I think you've mentioned it, has been focused on anxiety, issues around, the mental health of students. Do you think these are real factors? I mean, is this a kind of the hot media story of the moment, or do you think there's really something there? And actually, what role does the media actually have in this whole issue around absenteeism?
Thanks, Sasha. I think the media has been really important in opening up that discussion to help us understand the extent and begin to explore what is the role being played in terms of anxiety in relation to regular school attendance, and for us to begin to think about what we can do about that. However, there's also been a lot of commentary on taking of holidays, during term time. There's been a lot of commentary on cost of living. So I think what we need to be able to do is frame the conversation in a way that isn't just media driven with stories that are focusing on all of these kind of maybe smaller individual challenges, but broaden it out to what's impacting on everyone. And as I've already said, we know that the majority of schools are experiencing some of this challenge. So what is it as a country, as a society, what is our expectation in relation to regular school attendance? Everyone has said it today on the call, it has shifted. Children didn't have to go to school every day during COVID measures, and here we are now expecting that while all of us have changed how we work, with the majority of us, we have blended working, we may work remotely, we have this whole myriad of options post-COVID as to how we live our lives, yet children and young people were supposed to jump back in to school and into a routine that was for a world that changed, the same for them as it did for all of us. And I think what's really important is young people, like all of us, they want to be consulted, they want to be involved in that conversation around, well, why should I go to school every day? And again, it's been outlined for us, that impact, that long-term impact of a week, 2 weeks per year missing, what that is. But if you don't talk to a young person around that impact, if you don't talk about my expectation as a parent, my expectation as a school, my expectation as a community, where are all of us in that discussion, and where is the child and the young person in that discussion? Because I, for one, don't do anything that I haven't tried to negotiate and figure out why I should do it. And when I understand why I should do it, like going for a run every now and then, maybe eating less stuff that's bad for me, I'm more than happy to consider it, not always do it. But have we even begun to open up that conversation? So I think there's a key role for media to play. However, we want to be sure that the media aren't distracting us down rabbit holes of whether people should go on expensive holidays in term time or not in term time, and cost of living issues around that. But what we want to focus on, I think, is why should I, at 15, go to school every day? What's the benefit for me? Where does that lead me in life? And if I choose not to, what does, what is the impact that's likely to come from that? And I think that is the beginning of the discussion we need to have, and we absolutely need to be hearing from children and young people within that. Thanks, Sasha.
Absolutely. So, Anya, maybe you can walk us through a little bit what Ireland is actually doing. How do you bring the voices of young people into these discussions? Andreas highlighted a range of policy responses, from prosecution to support to parental engagement, community engagement. What methods is Ireland employing to actually address the issue, to hear from young people and to bring young people back into schools?
Okay, yeah. So I suppose one of the pieces we have taken a look at this year, we're at the start of a 5-year plan around how we improve school attendance, because I think that is a big piece. We need to plan to step back out of this. We have absolutely established it's not going to happen by accident. And what we have done in Ireland this year is to start the discussion around regular school attendance. So let's step it back out. We want children to attend regularly. And, this winter we were right, there wasn't a particular need around public health messaging. Within that, we have done a series of 6 webinars looking at what is the framework in which you can plan. We've used Patricia Grayseck and Christopher Carney's MDM-TSS model, the multi-dimensional framework in relation to planning to improve school attendance, and stepped principals and other related partners through using that model, and we're building capacity on that side. The other piece then we have done is we've had a poster competition and gone out to young people and said, what sort of pictures and images, what sort of slogan do you want to see? And a really powerful one that I've heard back from, again, that 14, 15-year-old group is, tell your friend to come to school. I go to school, my friend goes to school. Back to that connectedness bit, back to that other benefits in addition to teaching and learning of being in school. And when your friend's there, you feel safe, you feel welcome. So we want the message to come from the young people to help us frame what I hope in year 2 of our plan will be a society-wide back of the bus, national media, social media campaign that says, please go to school every day. Ireland thinks you should go to school every day. But underpinning that should be an absolute partnership approach at school level with children and young people, with school leadership and principals, and with our colleagues in the inspectorate and in the psychological services, and us as a school attendance and school promotion service, saying, what is our plan at school level, at community level? What can we do? What are children telling us are the soft barriers? And Michael touched on some soft and pretty challenging barriers that young people have to overcome in different communities and contexts about getting in, and that we build a message that has a national umbrella that says we want you to come every day, but we allow for that local flexibility about getting that message really, really right for the different communities who are experiencing the post-COVID impact a little bit differently depending on where they started. So I think that's our sort of, kind of very micro and then very macro approach. And then absolutely, as others have said, that need to bring everybody. This is everybody's issue. We need everybody involved. It's not the principal's issue. It's not my issue in a school attendance service. It's not a parent issue. It is how we all go about it together and plan for success, because it's not going to happen by accident.
Wonderful. Absolutely. Bringing those voices around the table. And I love the poster example, I think, because that really highlights something that, I wouldn't have thought of, the message, get my friend to come to school and I will too, is something that I think is so interesting that, actually will resonate with young people, probably more so than the kind of top-down messaging. Bjorn, can I turn to you next? I know Norway has a new Education Act coming out in August. What role do you expect the legislation to play in addressing absenteeism in the country?
Well, I talked about earlier that we've had a lot of focus on short-term absence, and in upper secondary school or high school, the way we've done that is by having a cap on how much absence you can have in order to receive a diploma. But we see that that doesn't really fit to work with the kind of absence we're talking about today. And one of the new aspects in this law that we're doing is an increased duty on behalf of the school to do close follow-up on students who are in danger of falling out of the school system or have a lot of absence. And this also starting all the way in primary schools, also with young students. and children. And I think that one of the logics that I think this can help with is that, yes, we need to tailor a lot of the measures to the individual child because it's complex, it's difficult. But the way we can enable that our systems work, tailoring services, is by having a systematic approach to it, about enabling that this is a system that's in place, it's duties, it's routines, it's built into how each local school works, so it's not starting from scratch every time you have a new child with difficulties, but there is a system in place. And one of the issues that we have a lot of focus on now is then developing what we in Norway call the team around the child or the student, which is to recognize that, yes, the school is always part of the equation when we talk about absence, but maybe they should not be alone in it. We need to engage all the other services. And we need to think about how is it we approach the families and the child when we offer help. Because when a school, for instance, sends a message of concern to the child welfare services about the child, very often parents will feel attacked. That is a criticism, that something is wrong with how they're doing, instead of maybe the child welfare services in the school inviting the parents to a meeting saying, how can we help you? We see that you are having issues. So it's about maybe creating some best practice, creating some systemic ways of approaching this where we make the services that are all part of this team work better together, and then maybe also thinking about how can more of these services be present in school. So we don't take students out of school in order to get help, but we get the help to where children are, which is in school every day. But this is not the things I'm talking about now is more on the planning level. But we do think that this new part in the Educational Act about this duty to do the follow-up could maybe potentially be a driver to make this happen and to make the school leaders really take ownership of the students that are struggling with absence.
Thanks so much, Bjorn. So Mike, I want to bring you back in here because one thing Bjorn talked about is the potential for messages to be miscommunicated or misreceived, or, you know, to have really either you call it the last mile or the front line of really those that are talking to families in their homes. And I know this is something that Concentric Ed is really specialized in. So maybe you can talk us through your approach and some of the lessons that your company has learned in that respect.
So our motto is one door at a time, one student at a time. And because of that, we make no assumptions. Oftentimes you're seeing information presented in the aggregate, and we seek out the information that builds the aggregate, right? So we take an ethnographic approach to our work. We want to immerse ourselves in the communities of the students and the families that we support so that we have a great understanding of their lived experience, right? We take that information and we get it back to the schools immediately. Prior to me joining Concentric, we used to document the outcomes of our home visits in spreadsheets. But quickly after joining the team, we learned that we needed to develop an app, and so we developed our home visit and student engagement app so that we can properly collect the data or the information or the stories that we're learning out in the field. In a way that we can aggregate, see trends, but then also still elevate the voices of the families, right? And what we've learned is that there are a lot of things that color the data that's being reported about chronic absenteeism, right? And so when we think about a student being absent, we're not really sure whether or not the student is still enrolled in the district, right? And so what we do is we find that many of our students are transient, many of them withdraw from school, and that information is not reported. And then so school districts are being charged with higher levels of chronic absenteeism for students that are no longer theirs, right? And so what we do with schools is we use our 5-step framework, starting with our pre-visit meeting, to do a deep dive into data so that they can understand what the numbers are telling them that they need to do, whether or not a home visit would be best for a student. Do we know if the student is already having transportation issues, for example? Can we solve for problems that may be already familiar with those people who are sitting around a table? Then we do the home visit, collect the data in the app, come back in our post-visit meeting, and we discuss what it is that we learn. So we're ensuring that that schools are responding or acting upon the data that we collected, right? And so steps 4 and 5, I call them the fraternal twins, is because we're going through a period of monitoring and then sharing the support using the multi-tier system of support that is used in the United States and maybe in other countries. But the idea is to watch and seek from when students return back to school, ensure that they are engaged with additional support for those students who are missing consecutive days, and then aligning them with the correct support that is going to get them the help that they need.
Thanks so much. It's fascinating, and I think this question about what you do with the data and how you make sure that the right data get to the right policymakers, I think is so critical. And Andreas, from the OECD's perspective, do we see data gaps? I mean, obviously, a lot of the speakers here have spoken about the multidimensional data that you need from the kind of household level to the aggregate level. Do we see major data gaps in from the big picture, and what are countries doing to close those gaps?
Yeah, I think the point of data that many of you made is so crucial. You cannot improve what you cannot see. If you do not know about, the early signals of dropout, there's not much that you can do to act at this. And actually, today we live in a time where actually artificial intelligence, more complex data systems can actually solve a lot of these problems. But when we, in our last digital education outlook, looked at who has those systems in place, we found 5 from 29 countries that we studied, where you could say, well, at least they make a serious effort to integrate these data sources, because we're not just necessarily talking about collecting more data. We're talking about integrating the data and making them available at the right time to the right people. And that is what technology actually is really good at. But I think we're at the very, very beginning. Most systems do not have the kind of data predictive analytics in place that we could generate even from today's kind of data sources. The second point I want to make, and I think Mike and Björn stressed it several times, schools are becoming responsible for a much wider range of activities. And this is not something that we should just accept but embrace. In a way, I think schools should become the hub that actually integrates those different social services and makes it accessible to students. That what Björn said, putting a team around a child. Also, making, teachers, being not just great instructors, but become good coaches, good mentors, good facilitators, good social workers, good, psychologists. I think that's really, really important, that there is kind of that sense that we are here to serve the needs of a student, whatever nature they are, and we find and build and mobilize whatever resources it takes to do that. But I also want to bring, one more point. I think that Aim made really very well, and that is, let's listen to the children themselves. Student voice, student choice. That I think making learning relevant. I do think, a insignificant part of the problem is that young people no longer perceive that school is effectively preparing them for their life, for their future. And actually, many young people at age 15 in the PISA survey say that very clearly. This is not the place that builds my future and my life. And I think we just need to not lose sight of that, to make learning more relevant for a wider range of people by giving them more voice, more choice, and making them part of the co-creation of modern learning environments.
Thanks so much, Andreas. With just 1 minute left, I want to ask Björn one final question. I know you're taking part in the OECD peer learning project. What does Norway hope to get out of the project?
I think it's a great opportunity I think that the whole process of peer learning, where you can kind of mirror your own problems in others, and through that get ideas and input, this is great. And I think, I know now Ireland is part of it as well. And the issue that Anya brought up, for instance, with how to get the child's voice in, is something that we're very keen on. So I think just this discussion today has shown that we have, despite our systems being somewhat different, we have so many problems that we're all dealing with. And I think just getting together, talking about the same thing for a certain amount of time, something good will come out of that. And the other thing, I think, is that it forces us to get out of kind of a showcase ourselves with the focus on what we're good at, to also dare to say, what are we struggling with? What's difficult? Which I think is also constructive. So, I mean, that's a bit general, but I think yeah, just to be able to get that conversation, I think will be great input into future policies in my country.
Thanks so much, Bjorn. Huge thanks to all of our panelists. Apologies, we're out of time. I have 100 questions I didn't get to. We could have spoken about this all day, but as Andrea said, all countries are welcome to join our initiative, and we encourage that. But huge thanks to all of our panelists for a fascinating discussion, and thanks to the hundreds of people who joined online from all around the world. We'll see you next time for the next webinar. Thanks.